Some names transcend the simple designation of a person. They become symbols, ideas, diagnoses. Utter the word sadism, and the imagination instantly conjures an image of cruelty, violence, and the pleasure derived from another's suffering. This word, firmly embedded in our language, psychology, and criminology, originated from the name of a single man, Donatien Alphonse François, the Marquis de Sade. To most, he is a monster, a pervert, a pornographer, a degenerate aristocrat whose life was a series of scandalous orgies and cruel crimes. His books are forbidden fruit, literature that for centuries was burned, hidden, and read in secret. But what if I told you this picture is only part of the truth, and the most primitive part at that? What if behind the image of this monster hid a philosopher, a thinker who pushed the boldest ideas of the Enlightenment to their logical extreme? What if the man whose name became a synonym for cruelty was, in fact, a radical explorer of absolute, unlimited freedom? What if he spent 32 years of his life in prisons, including the infamous Bastille, less for his actual crimes and more for his ideas, which frightened both kings and revolutionaries? This is not a story about pornography. It is a story about the darkest, most dangerous, and most honest thought in human history. We will not justify his crimes. We will attempt to understand his philosophy. We will descend into the abyss to comprehend how damned words and damned thinkers are born. This will be a difficult and provocative journey. If you are ready to venture into the darkest corners of the human soul, to find not only darkness, but also glimmers of genius, subscribe to our channel, Personalities in Detail. We are just beginning our investigation. To understand this monster or genius, we must travel to the brilliant and hypocritical France of the mid-18th century. An era when the reason of the Enlightenment coexisted with the absolute power of the king and the most savage of morals. Donatien Alphonse François de Sade was born on June 2, 1740, in Paris, at the magnificent Hôtel de Condé. He was born at the very pinnacle of the world, in the epicenter of the French aristocracy. His family, the de Sades, was one of the oldest and most noble in Provence, tracing its lineage, according to family legend, to Laura, the immortal muse of the great poet Petrarch. His mother, Marie-Éléonore de Maillé-Brézé, was a lady-in-waiting to the Princess de Condé, one of the most influential women in the kingdom. It seemed he was destined for the brilliant, predictable, and utterly empty fate of a courtier, warrior, and aristocrat. But from the very beginning, his life was marked by a seal of alienation and coldness. His father, the Count de Sade, was a typical aristocrat of his time, a frivolous diplomat, a debauchee, and a gambler who took almost no part in his son's upbringing, seeing him merely as the heir to the family name. His mother, young and beautiful, was completely absorbed in court intrigues, balls, and the pursuit of influential lovers. Shortly after giving birth to her son, having fulfilled her dynastic duty, she first sent him to a wet nurse in the countryside, and then, when the boy turned 4, to Provence, to the castle of his paternal uncle, the Abbé de Sade. This uncle abbot, a scholar and a notorious libertine, a man of very liberal morals, became his first and perhaps most important educator. He gave the boy an excellent classical education, but more importantly, He introduced him to the world of free thinking, skepticism, and the refined debauchery that reigned in enlightened aristocratic circles. At 10 years old, Donatien was sent to the prestigious Jesuit Collège Louis le Grand in Paris. It was one of the best educational institutions in Europe, but it was also known for its brutal discipline, corporal punishment, and, as was often the case in all-male boarding schools, an atmosphere of hidden violence and suppressed sexuality. It is here, as many biographers believe, that a deep, lifelong hatred for any form of authority, discipline, and especially religion, which he considered the primary tool for human enslavement, was born in the young de Sade's soul. At 14, as was expected of an aristocrat, he entered a military school, and then, with the rank of cornet, went to fight in the 7 Years' War. He participated in battles, witnessed death, blood, cruelty, and looting, which were considered the norm for armies of that time. The war definitively shaped his view of the world as an arena governed not by virtue, but by raw, instinctual force, where morality is merely an invention of the weak to restrain the strong.
The decorations are truly exquisite.
Returning from the war, the 23-year-old Marquis de Sade, a title he inherited after his father's death, was already a fully formed man, a brilliantly educated aristocrat, a cynical veteran, a convinced atheist, and a libertine hungry for pleasure and experimentation. His family, concerned by his scandalous reputation and growing debts, decided to marry him off. His marriage was a cynical commercial transaction, typical of the era. They chose for him Renée Pélagie de Montreuil, the eldest daughter of the president of the tax court, a man of no great lineage, but of fabulous wealth. De Sade was in love with her younger sister, but the family insisted on the marriage with the elder, as her dowry was larger. He complied. In 1763, he married a woman he did not love, but who, to everyone's astonishment, would become his most loyal ally, his accomplice, and his guardian angel through decades of persecution. The marriage did not change him. On the contrary, having gained access to his wife's vast fortune, he plunged headfirst into the world of Paris's secret pleasures. He took mistresses and frequented elite brothels where he staged increasingly elaborate theatrical experiments. Very soon, this led to his first clash with the law. Just a few months after his wedding, in October of 1763, he was arrested and imprisoned in the Vincennes fortress. The charge was shocking: extreme debauchery and blasphemy. During an orgy with prostitutes, he had allegedly forced them to participate in sacrilegious rituals and subjected them to whippings. By the standards of the time, this was a terrible crime. But even more terrifying was who stood behind his arrest. It was not the king, but his own mother-in-law, Madame de Montreuil. This domineering, sanctimonious, and incredibly influential woman, humiliated by the behavior of her son-in-law who was disgracing her family, decided to use her connections at court to re-educate him. She obtained a royal order of arrest, a lettre de cachet, which allowed for imprisonment without trial. Thus began her long and bitter war against the Marquis de Sade, a war that would ultimately break his life and transform him from a simple libertine into a writer and philosopher. That first arrest was brief. After a few weeks, thanks to family connections, he was released, but it was only the first warning bell. He did not understand, or did not want to understand, that his private, secret pleasures, which he considered his inalienable right, were in conflict with public morality and the law. He believed that as an aristocrat, as a sovereign individual, he had the right to explore all facets of human passion, paying no mind to the prejudices of the crowd. And this conviction, this philosophy of absolute freedom that he would hone throughout his life, would lead him down a path that ended at the very bottom of a cell in the Bastille. The first confinement in the Vincennes fortress should have been a cold shower for the 23-year-old Marquis de Sade, a warning from the system that even for an aristocrat there were limits. But it had the opposite effect. Instead of being frightened and settling down, he was enraged. He perceived it not as a just punishment, but as an act of tyranny, an assault on his personal freedom by his hated mother-in-law and a hypocritical society. Upon his release, he not only continued his experiments, but made them even more audacious, as if challenging the entire world. The next few years were a period of relative calm. He played the role of a respectable family man, managed his estates in Provence, engaged in theater, which he adored his entire life, and even received the honorary post of the king's representative. His wife, Renée Pélagie, bore him 3 children. But behind this respectable facade lay a double life. He secretly maintained a whole staff of mistresses, and his Château de la Coste in Provence, as remote and impregnable as an eagle's nest, gradually transformed into his personal theater of cruelty, a laboratory for studying the darkest sides of human sexuality. Then in 1768, a scandal erupted that shook all of France and forever cemented his reputation as a monster: the Rose Keller affair. Rose Keller was an impoverished widow begging for alms on the streets of Paris. One Easter Sunday, an elegant gentleman approached her and offered her a job as a housekeeper in his country house. This gentleman was the Marquis de Sade. He brought her to his home in Marseille, but instead of giving her work, he locked her in a room. There, according to Keller's testimony, he ordered her to undress, tied her to a bed, and brutally whipped her, inflicting wounds with a penknife and pouring hot wax on them. He then left her locked up, promising to return and continue. Rose Keller managed to break free and escape. Half naked and covered in blood, she ran to the nearest village and reported the Marquis to the police. The scandal was monstrous. An aristocrat torturing a poor widow on the holy day of Easter was too much even for the worldly sensibilities of the 18th century. De Sade was arrested and thrown into the Château de Saumur. His family was horrified, but this time they decided to act not with force, but with money and influence. His wife, the loyal Renée Pélagie, and his father-in-law, despite the mother-in-law's hatred, did everything to hush up the affair. They paid Rose Keller a huge sum of money to officially withdraw her accusations. After 7 months in prison, thanks to the intervention of influential relatives at court, de Sade was released by the king's personal order. Officially, he was pardoned, but in the eyes of society, he was condemned. Rumors of his cruelty, embellished with the most incredible details, spread through all the salons of Paris. He became a pariah, an outcast. But instead of lying low, he rebelled again. Humiliated and embittered, he retreated to his Château de la Coste, and there gave free rein to his boldest fantasies. In 1772, the most notorious crime of his life occurred, known as the Marseille affair. Along with his servant Latour, who was his faithful assistant and possibly his lover, de Sade organized a grand orgy in Marseille with 4 prostitutes. During this orgy, he gave the girls an aphrodisiac, quote, one, candies laced with cantharides. In small doses, this substance was considered an excitant, but in large quantities, it was a poison. The girls became ill. Two of them, believing they had been poisoned, ran to the police in a panic and filed a complaint. This time, the charges were much more serious: poisoning and sodomy. At that time in France, sodomy was punishable by death at the stake. De Sade and his servant, warned by friends, managed to flee to Italy. But the trial was held in absentia. The Parliament of Aix-en-Provence, the highest judicial body in the region, hostile to the noble and arrogant Marquis, delivered the harshest possible sentence. Donatien Alphonse Francois, the Marquis de Sade, and his servant were sentenced to death. Their effigies were publicly beheaded and burned in the main square of Aix. For de Sade, it was a catastrophe. He became a state criminal, stripped of his titles and property, with a death sentence hanging over his head. And again, paradoxically, his wife came to his aid. The faithful Renée Pélagie managed to have the most terrifying part of the sentence, the charge of sodomy, overturned. But the charges of poisoning and debauchery remained. Meanwhile, de Sade, hiding in Italy, could not resist new adventures. He was soon arrested in Savoy and imprisoned in the fortress of Miolans by personal order of the King of Sardinia, who was a relative of his mother-in-law. Madame de Montreuil, his relentless enemy, continued her hunt. After 5 months, with the help of his wife, who came to him and possibly bribed guards, he made a daring, almost cinematic escape from the impregnable Alpine fortress. He secretly returned to his Château de Lacoste and lived there like a ghost, hiding from the authorities. It was during this period, in the mid-1770s, that the Château de Lacoste transformed into his true kingdom of darkness. He hired young maids and actors, creating his own small commune, his own theater, where he was both director and lead actor. Here he staged his plays. Here he held orgies that became increasingly complex and ritualized. It was here that he first began to systematically explore what would later be called sadism. But his sanctuary was not eternal. In 1777, during a trip to Paris, he was tracked down. By another lettre de cachet, signed by the king under pressure from his all-powerful mother-in-law, he was arrested. This time, for a long time. He was once again thrown into the grim Vincennes fortress. He was 37 years old. He did not yet know that he would only be released 13 years later into a completely different country after the storming of the Bastille and the start of the French Revolution. It was here, in the cold, damp cells of the Vincennes fortress and later the Bastille, cut off from the world and deprived of all pleasures but one, the pleasure of thought and writing, that the Marquis de Sade, the aristocrat, died. In his place, de Sade, the writer and philosopher, was born. Deprived of the ability to act, he began to describe. In his mind, and then on paper, monstrous but meticulously crafted worlds were born. These were worlds where neither God, nor morality, nor law existed. Worlds where the only driving force was nature in its most brutal Darwinian manifestation. Worlds where the strong have the absolute right to enjoy themselves at the expense of the weak. He began to write his first great damned novels, 120 Days of Sodom, a monstrous, catalog-like list of every conceivable and inconceivable sexual perversion and act of cruelty. This is not pornography. It is a cold, almost scientific treatise, an attempt to classify the abyss of human vice. He wrote this novel in microscopic script on narrow strips of paper, which he then glued into a 12-meter scroll and hid in the wall of his cell in the Bastille. Then came Justine, or The Misfortunes of Virtue. The story of a pious, innocent girl who tries to live by the laws of morality and religion, and for this is subjected to endless humiliation, torture, and violence. And then its antithesis, Juliet, the story of her wicked sister, who rejects all morality, indulges in the most monstrous crimes, and ultimately achieves wealth, power, and happiness. Through these novels, de Sade wages a furious polemic against the entire philosophy of the Enlightenment, against Rousseau, who believed in the natural goodness of man, against Voltaire, who believed in reason and justice. De Sade screams at them from his cell, quote 2, quote 3. He was not merely a pornographer. He was a radical materialist and atheist who took these ideas to their most terrifying and misanthropic conclusion. If God does not exist, then everything is permitted, absolutely everything. This was a thought so destructive, so dangerous, that it frightened even the most audacious freethinkers of his era. It was for this idea, not for flogging prostitutes, that he was imprisoned for decades. He was not just a criminal. He was an ideological terrorist, and his primary weapon became the word. The years spent in the grim, damp fortress of Vincennes transformed the Marquis de Sade into a completely different man. The aristocratic libertine, who sought only fleeting sensual pleasures, died in that stone tomb. In his place was born an obsessed, furious, and tireless writer, whose only way to exist, breathe, and rebel was with paper and ink. The prison, which his mother-in-law and the king intended to break his spirit and force him to repent, became his true university and his sole creative laboratory. Deprived of all external stimuli, he undertook the only journey possible into the depths of his own soul, into the darkest and most unexplored corners of the human psyche. In 1784, after nearly 7 years in Vincennes, he was transferred. He was moved to the most famous, most sinister, and most hated prison in France, the ultimate symbol of royal tyranny, the Bastille. This transfer was not a tightening of his sentence, but, strangely enough, a relaxation of his confinement. The Bastille, though a symbol of terror, was intended for noble prisoners. Here he had a more spacious cell with a view of the Arsenal Gardens. He was allowed to bring and continually expand his enormous library, which numbered hundreds of volumes, from ancient classics to the latest philosophical treatises of the Enlightenment. He was permitted to write, and he wrote. He wrote with a feverish, manic obsession, as if trying to pour onto paper all the demons that swarmed in his head after decades of confinement. He worked 10 to 12 hours a day, filling stacks of paper. It was here, in his Bastille cell, that he completed his most scandalous novels, Justine and Aline and Valcour. And it was here that he created his most monstrous and perhaps most important work, the 120 Days of Sodom, or the School of Libertinage. This was not just a book, it was an act of intellectual terrorism, a challenge to all of humanity. On narrow strips of paper that he secretly brought into his cell, he used microscopic, cramped handwriting to create what he considered a scientific work, an exhaustive, cold, almost mathematical encyclopedia of evil. He attempted to catalog, classify, and dissect every imaginable and unimaginable form of human vice and cruelty. The plot was merely a frame. 4 wealthy libertines locked themselves in a secluded castle and listened to the stories of 4 experienced procuresses who systematically described 600 different perversions, from the most innocent to the most monstrous. This is not pornography in the conventional sense. There is no passion in the book. It is a cold, detached, almost scientific treatise, an attempt to classify the abyss of human vices with the precision of an entomologist studying insects. He wrote this novel in secret on a single 12-meter-long scroll and hid it in a specially made hiding place in his cell wall. Then came Justine, or The Misfortunes of Virtue, the story of a pious, innocent girl who tries to live by the laws of Christian morality and human kindness. For her virtue, she is subjected to endless humiliation, torture, and violence by everyone she meets. Her counterpart is Juliet, the story of her depraved, selfish sister, who from a young age rejects all morality, indulges in the most monstrous crimes, including murder and betrayal, and ultimately achieves wealth, power, and absolute happiness. Through these novels, de Sade wages a furious, bloody polemic against the entire optimistic philosophy of the Enlightenment, against Rousseau, who believed in the natural goodness of man, and against Voltaire, who believed in the triumph of reason and justice. From his prison cell, de Sade screams at them, quote, "He was not merely a pornographer. He was a radical materialist and atheist who took these ideas to their most terrifying, misanthropic yet logical conclusion. If God does not exist, then everything is permitted. Absolutely everything." This idea was so destructive, so dangerous to any social order, be it a monarchy or a republic, that it terrified even the most audacious freethinkers of his time. It was for this thought, not for flogging prostitutes, that he was imprisoned for decades. He was not just a sexual criminal. He was an ideological terrorist, and his primary weapon became the word. In July of 1789, that word escaped the confines of his cell. Paris was boiling. The people were driven to desperation by hunger and poverty. Rumors circulated that the king was gathering troops to disperse the National Assembly and drown the seeds of revolution in blood. The atmosphere was electrified, and from his Bastille window overlooking the Faubourg Saint-Antoine, the Marquis de Sade saw the crowds, felt their anger, and decided to act. He fashioned a makeshift megaphone from a tin funnel and a table board and began to shout to the crowd gathering at the fortress walls. Quote, "It was most likely a lie, but it was a lie that struck the very nerve of the moment. The governor of the Bastille, Marquis de Launay, was horrified by this outburst. He could not silence the prisoner. And so, on July 4th, he obtained an order for the immediate transfer of his most riotous and dangerous inmate. That night, without his belongings, his books, and most importantly, his manuscripts, de Sade was seized and moved to the Charenton asylum. He screamed that he was being robbed, that his only treasure was being taken from him. He did not know that this transfer would save his life. 10 days later, on July 14th, A Parisian mob, incited in part by the rumors de Sade had spread, stormed the Bastille. The fortress fell. The French Revolution had begun. During the assault, his cell was looted. The priceless 12-meter scroll of the 120 Days of Sodom vanished without a trace. For de Sade, this was a tragedy he mourned for the rest of his life, saying he shed ____, quote, _6, ___, for his lost creation. The scroll, it was later discovered, had been found and preserved by one of the attackers and was kept secretly in private collections for over 100 years. The fall of the Bastille brought freedom to him as well. In 1790, by a decree of the new revolutionary government that abolished the lettres de cachet, the Marquis de Sade was released after 13 years of continuous imprisonment. He was 50 years old, ruined, and ill. His wife, tired of the scandals, had divorced him. The old world of the aristocracy in which he had grown up was crumbling before his eyes. He was a stranger in this new, revolutionary France, but he was a fighter. He enthusiastically embraced the revolution, which he believed embodied his ideas of freedom. He renounced his aristocratic title and began calling himself simply ___, quote, _7, ___. He joined the most radical section of Paris, the Peaks section, where the Jacobins met. He wrote revolutionary pamphlets, gave speeches, and tried to find his place in this new, brutal world. Here, the central paradox of his personality emerged. He, the theorist of absolute cruelty, proved to be a humanist in real life. When he, as a former aristocrat who knew his neighbors, was appointed president of his section's revolutionary tribunal, he used his position not to settle scores, but to save people from the guillotine. He sabotaged trials and delayed cases. When his worst enemies, his mother-in-law and father-in-law, whom he had every reason to hate, were brought before him, he did everything to save them. This leniency did not go unnoticed. To the radical Jacobins led by Robespierre, who had unleashed the Great Terror, Citizen Sade was a suspicious figure, an aristocrat, a moderate, a humanist. This was a ready-made death sentence. In December of 1793, he was arrested on charges of moderatism and thrown into prison. His name was placed on the execution lists. Every day, he waited for them to come for him. One day, he and other condemned prisoners were led into the prison yard for transport to the guillotine. But in the chaos, due to a bureaucratic error, his cell was overlooked during the roll call. He survived by chance. A few days later, Robespierre's regime fell. De Sade, who was supposed to be executed as an enemy of the revolution, was saved by a counter-revolutionary coup. He was free again, but he was utterly broken. He was disillusioned with everything, with the monarchy that had imprisoned him for 13 years, and with the revolution that had nearly beheaded him for his humanism. He, the theorist of cruelty, could not endure the real, state-sanctioned brutality of the guillotine. His philosophy had shattered upon impact with reality. He was a destitute, sick, old man, rejected by all regimes. To survive, he was forced to write anonymous pornographic novels. But this final period of freedom was coming to an end. A new star was already rising on the horizon, a new dictator who would not tolerate a radical like him, Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte. Emerging from a revolutionary prison in 1794, the Marquis de Sade found himself in ruins, not just the ruins of his own life, but of an entire world. The old aristocratic France, which he despised but to which he belonged by birth, was destroyed. The new Republican France, in whose freedom he had so naively believed, proved to be an even bloodier and more hypocritical tyrant, nearly sending him to the scaffold for his moderation. He was a man without an era, without status, without money. His castles in Provence had been looted and burned by peasants. His wife had divorced him. He was a destitute, sick, old man, nearly 60 years old. To survive, he was forced to do something he despised: work. He took a job as a prompter in a theater, scraped by with odd jobs, and he wrote, anonymously, under pseudonyms, creating cheap Gothic novels and pornographic pamphlets that were in demand in this new, morally freer but intellectually impoverished France. It was humiliating for a man of his talent and ambition. But in 1800, he made one last desperate attempt to assert himself as a serious writer and philosopher. He anonymously published his two most famous novels, Justine and Juliet. It was an act of madness. France had already changed. The era of revolutionary chaos had given way to the rigid, authoritarian rule of First Consul Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon, determined to restore order, declared war not only on political opponents, but also on moral depravity. The scandalous books, which openly preached atheism, denied all morality, and detailed the most monstrous crimes, could not go unnoticed. Napoleon's secret police, led by the infamous Joseph Fouché, quickly identified the author. In 1801, the Marquis de Sade was arrested, right in the printing press where he was producing a new batch of his books. This time there was no formal charge, no trial. Napoleon's regime acted even more cynically than the monarchy. Without any legal proceedings, de Sade was declared mentally ill and sent first to prison, then, in 1803, transferred to the Charenton Asylum for the Insane. It was the final sentence. His enemies, from the king to Napoleon, had finally found the perfect way to silence him forever. Not to execute him as a criminal or a martyr, but to simply erase him from society by declaring him insane. Thus began the final 13-year act of his life. The Charenton Asylum, run by the progressive Abbé de Coulmiers, was not exactly a prison. Here they practiced what was called, quote, nine, treating the mentally ill through theatrical productions. For de Sade, who had loved the theater his entire life, this became a final outlet. He, inmate number 1, was given permission to organize a theater troupe within the asylum. The actors were other patients, madmen, melancholics, and maniacs. This strange, grotesque troupe, under the direction of the old Marquis, staged his own plays. These performances drew all of fashionable Paris. It was a trendy, nerve-tingling amusement to come and watch real lunatics perform in a theater directed by the foremost madman and pervert in France. For de Sade, this was a final, mocking form of fame. He was once again the center of attention. He could create, he could direct, but he was a captive, surrounded by real, not imagined, madmen. The line between his fictional worlds and reality blurred. He who had spent his life exploring madness was now immersed in it. But even here, the system would not leave him in peace. The authorities, first under Napoleon and then under the restored Bourbons, were furious that de Sade was allowed to engage in, quote, 10 activities. They took away his paper and ink and forbade him to write. They banned his plays. they tried once more to throw him into solitary confinement. He died in Charenton on December 2nd, 1814, at the age of 74. In his will, written long before, he asked that his body be buried without ceremony in an unmarked grave over which a dense forest would grow. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 11, underscore, underscore. His wish was violated. He was buried in the Charenton Cemetery, and later, when the cemetery was moved, his skull was extracted by a phrenologist who wanted to study the bumps on the skull of the great pervert, and then it vanished without a trace. Even in death, he found no peace. His son, to whom he had entrusted his manuscripts, only partially fulfilled his father's final wish. He burned most of the unpublished works, including what is believed to have been a massive multi-volume work that de Sade considered his life's masterpiece. He wanted to cleanse the family name of its shame. It seemed as though the Marquis de Sade's wish had come true. The memory of him and his ideas was nearly erased. His name became merely a curse word, a synonym for cruelty. But, as is well known, manuscripts don't burn. The death of the Marquis de Sade in 1814 and the subsequent burning of his manuscripts by his son seemed to put a final end to his story. The system he had fought his entire life, first monarchical, then revolutionary, then Napoleonic, had finally won. His body was buried, his skull stolen and lost, his thoughts turned to ash. If his name was remembered at all, it was only in whispers, as a synonym for the most monstrous debauchery and cruelty. He became a cautionary tale, the boogeyman of European culture. He achieved what he had requested in his will. The memory of him was almost erased from people's minds. But this oblivion was short-lived. The seeds he had sown were too poisonous and too resilient to simply disappear. His ideas, like a virus, persisted underground in the few surviving, secretly published copies of his books, passed from hand to hand as forbidden, dangerous knowledge. The first to begin his rehabilitation were not philosophers but artists. In the 19th century, during the age of Romanticism and later decadence, his figure began to attract those who rebelled against hypocritical bourgeois morality. Poets like Charles Baudelaire and Algernon Swinburne saw him not merely as a pornographer but as a great rebel, a damned poet who dared to peer into the darkest abysses of the human soul. For them, his cruelty was not a crime, but a form of aesthetic protest, a metaphor for the struggle of a solitary genius against a sanctimonious society. But the real explosion of interest in de Sade occurred at the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries, linked to the birth of a new science, psychoanalysis. Psychiatrists such as Richard von Krafft-Ebing, while studying sexual deviations, stumbled upon his works. It was Krafft-Ebing who introduced the term sadism into scientific discourse, defining it as deriving pleasure from inflicting pain on others. Thus, the Marquis's name was definitively transformed into a medical diagnosis. Paradoxically, this is precisely what saved him from oblivion. His works moved from the realm of sordid pornography into the category of scientific documents, clinical cases to be studied to understand the dark side of human nature. Then, in the early 20th century, the surrealists took an interest in him. For André Breton, Luis Buñuel, and Salvador Dali, who proclaimed the liberation of the subconscious, of dreams and desires, as well as of reason and morality, de Sade became a prophet. They saw in him not just a writer, but a spiritual revolutionary who 150 years before them had performed the ultimate surrealist act. He had completely freed his imagination. The poet Guillaume Apollinaire called him, quote, 13, quote. The surrealists began to republish his works and write articles about him, proclaiming him one of their patron saints alongside Rimbaud and La Rochefoucauld. It was then, in 1904, that what can only be described as the greatest miracle in this story occurred. A German bibliophile traveling through Berlin accidentally found and bought an ancient, unidentified manuscript scroll from a bookseller. It was the very same, thought to be lost forever, 12-meter-long scroll of the 120 Days of Sodom that de Sade had dropped in his cell during the storming of the Bastille. The manuscript for which he had wept tears of blood was resurrected. This discovery had the effect of an exploding bomb. Now de Sade could be studied not from anonymous, distorted, pirated editions, but from his own texts. After World War II, his figure moved from the fields of art and psychiatry into the realm of serious philosophy. French existentialist and post-structuralist thinkers Jean-Paul Sartre, Simone de Beauvoir, Georges Bataille, Michel Foucault saw in him something more than just a rebel or a clinical case. They saw him as a key figure for understanding all of modern civilization. In her famous essay, quote, 14, Simone de Beauvoir posed the central question. She argued that to ignore de Sade is to turn a blind eye to an uncomfortable truth about humanity. His philosophy, based on absolute egoism, is an extreme viewpoint, taken to the point of absurdity, yet logically impeccable, which must be understood in order to be opposed. Michel Foucault, studying the history of power and madness, showed that de Sade's confinement was not merely a punishment, but an act of the Great Confinement, an attempt by 19th century society to isolate and silence everything that did not fit into its new bourgeois norms of reason. De Sade was dangerous not for his sexuality, but for his mind, which refused to accept any limitations. Thus, step by step, the Marquis de Sade was transformed from a pornographer and a madman into one of the most important and provocative thinkers in history. His books, which were still being tried and banned in France in the mid-20th century, are now published in prestigious academic series with scholarly commentary. Dissertations are written about him, and conferences are held. He has become part of the canon, albeit its darkest, most cursed part. His influence on 19th and 21st century culture is immense, though not always obvious. From the films of Pier Paolo Pasolini's Salo, or the 120 Days of Sodom, and Nagisa Oshima's In the Realm of the Senses, to the music and aesthetics of rock bands and contemporary artists, his ideas about the connection between power, desire, and violence, and about rebellion against all norms, continue to inspire and shock. He lost during his lifetime. He lost everything: his title, his fortune, his family, his freedom, and even his name. But he achieved a resounding victory after death. His greatest enemy, the hypocritical morality he so despised, could not destroy him. His thought, like acid, corroded the prison walls and broke free. He wanted the memory of him to be erased from people's minds, but fate played one last, most cruel joke on him. It made him immortal. So, we have traveled the entire path from the luxurious salons of aristocratic Paris to the bloody fields of the 7 Years' War, from the secret rooms of the Château de Lacoste to the damp, cold cells of the Château de Vincennes. We have seen a frivolous aristocrat transform into a fierce philosopher. Citizen Sade tried to save people from the guillotine, and the system he despised ultimately locked him away in an asylum to silence him forever. We have witnessed his death in obscurity and his incredible, almost mystical resurrection in the minds of philosophers, poets, and rebels. Now that all the evidence is on the table, it is time to return to the main question we asked at the beginning. Who was he, this man whose name evokes both revulsion and an almost magnetic fascination? An aristocrat philosopher who dared to explore the most hidden corners of human freedom, or simply a monster, a psychopath whose name rightly became a synonym for cruelty. The arguments for the prosecution are obvious and irrefutable. The cases for which he was tried, the Rose Keller affair, the Marseille incident, are not fabrications of his enemies. They are real, documented facts. He subjected people to violence, risking their health and lives for his own pleasure. Even setting aside possible exaggerations, his actions were criminal and immoral by the laws of any era, not just the 18th century. His life, especially before his long imprisonment, was that of a selfish, spoiled, cruel aristocrat who believed his title and fortune entitled him to anything, and his books, even for the most open-minded reader, are a plunge into hell. They are worlds built on systematic humiliation, torture, and murder. His heroes, the villains, are not just criminals. They are philosophers of evil who, with cold, blood-curdling logic, prove their right to absolute cruelty. Reading de Sade is a difficult, almost physically agonizing ordeal, and a prosecutor at the trial of history could easily say, "A man who describes such horrors with such relish and detail cannot be sane. He is a monster, and his philosophy is merely the sophisticated self-justification of a monster." But the defense has equally compelling arguments. De Sade's lawyer might say, quote, 17. The defense would argue, quote, 18. Furthermore, the defense would point to his behavior during the Reign of Terror, when he, the theorist of evil, gained real power over people's lives and deaths. He refused to use it. He saved his enemies from the guillotine. The man who reveled in suffering in his fantasies could not bear the sight of real, legalized blood in real life. Does this not prove that there was a chasm between his literary world and his actual personality? And finally, the defense would say, he was imprisoned for 32 years, not for kidnapping prostitutes. He was imprisoned because he was absolutely, radically, unbearably free. He denied everything: the authority of the king, the authority of God, the authority of the family, the authority of public morality. He was the living embodiment of anarchy, and no regime, not monarchy, not republic, not empire, could tolerate the existence of a man who denied the very right of that regime to exist. He was a mirror in which every society saw its own hidden hypocrisy and cruelty, and for this, the mirror was shattered. So where does the truth lie? Perhaps there is no single truth. Perhaps de Sade is an eternal paradox. He was both at the same time. He was a real criminal, an aristocratic abuser, and he was a brilliant, fearless thinker. He was a monster, and he was a martyr for freedom. In him, as if at a focal point, the most extreme, most incompatible traits of human nature converged. His story is an uncomfortable, unsettling question, to which each of us has our own answer. Where is the line between freedom and license? What happens to a person when they reject all external authorities and decide to listen only to the voice of their instincts and their reason? And are we willing to gaze into the abyss he opened to better understand not only him, but ourselves? The Marquis de Sade wanted the memory of him to disappear, but he, more than anyone, proved that ideas, even the most terrible and destructive, are immortal. They can be banned, burned, and buried for centuries, but they will always find a way to return. His name, his cursed word, will forever remain in our language as an eternal reminder of the darkness that hides behind the thin veneer of civilization. A darkness he did not invent, but merely dared to call by its name. Now, the choice is yours. Aristocrat philosopher or monster, genius or madman, prophet or psychopath. History has presented all the evidence, and each person must render their own verdict. If you found this complex and provocative journey into the darkest corners of the human soul interesting, and if you believe that such damned figures should be discussed honestly and without censorship, please support our channel, Personalities in Detail, by subscribing. It's the best motivation for us to continue creating in-depth historical investigations.